Okay, so thank you to everyone for joining us for today's crisis management webinar. We've already got a lot of people on the line, so I know there's a lot of interest in this topic and this particular webinar, so thank you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. We're a specialist crisis management consultancy. We help leaders of businesses to plan, train, rehearse, and sometimes handle the worst days of their corporate lives. Sadly, many of us are having the worst days of our corporate lives at the moment and have been doing so for the last 4 or 5 weeks. Welcome to our clients, welcome to a number of Insignia's partners and contacts, and welcome also to IOD members who are joining us here today. I am particularly pleased to be joined on this webinar by Gus Whitcomb. Gus actually did a webinar for us a couple of years ago, which was extremely well received, and I thought that given Gus's experience, it would be really valuable for him to join us again at this particularly challenging time. Gus, as it says on the slide, is the head of group business resilience at Cathay Pacific, but like me, he brings 3 decades of crisis management experience to this session, both on the consultancy side and over the last 20 years or more in-house working within the aviation sector. That includes being the managing director of corporate communications on 9/11 for American Airlines. And for the last, how long, Gus? 20 years, 15 years at Cathay Pacific, now as head of group business resilience. The other thing I would say for Gus is that he has a huge passion for this subject, for making sure that not only businesses are protected from crisis, but most importantly that people are, to the extent that we can, protected from the damaging impact of crises. So Gus, thank you for joining us again. I'm really pleased to have you on this webinar.
Thanks, Jonathan. Glad to be here.
So we are going to chat over the next 40 minutes or so about how organisations may or may not have prepared for the pandemic outbreak, some of the learnings that we can take out of what's happened, and some of the planning that we can take forward. So, Gus, perhaps just to set the context for this, what would be within Cathay Pacific the normal kind of planning, training and exercising that you would be doing during any given year?
Yeah, I think, Jonathan, first of all, I would say that I always used to say when I was asked this question that there's no such thing as a normal year, but now I realize I've been very cavalier about that because obviously this is proving to be a very, very different year. But normally in our group business resilience team, we're looking at 3 different things that we're trying to get done. One is making sure that the plans that we have in place, and we have a number of plans that cover emergency response, generic business continuity, and some very specific areas of business continuity, making sure that those are updated, making sure that the business units are going through those, making sure that they're still valid, that the information is still good, and so on. Then doing quite a bit of training. Last year, for example, we brought in almost all of our field leaders into Hong Kong for a full day of classroom training on crisis leadership, which I'm very grateful we did this year. And then a huge focus for us is on exercises. I'm a firm believer that you can do all the planning in the world and you can do all of the training in the world, but if you don't see if it actually works, it's not reaching its maximum potential. So we are very heavily focused on exercises, and from that perspective, on a yearly basis, the folks within Cathay Pacific may want to beat up on me a couple of times, but we go through and make sure that every one of our facilities everywhere around the world does a refresher exercise at least once a year. On the group level, we're testing all 3 of our airlines, and we're looking at both emergency response and business continuity in those exercises. We also do what we call functional exercises, but some people might think of them as leads. And basically what that is, and this came from another person I used to work with, an American, who drilled this into me, and that is to make sure that although we all know what it is that we have to do we really know how we're going to do it? And in these functional exercises, we get down to the nuance of do we know exactly how we're going to move money, how we're going to protect it, who's going to go get it, on what days is it available, what times is this going on, and really go through that granular level to make sure that things are done. And so, through this whole series of things that we do, we then hope that we're ready if something, does befall us.
Clearly, in many ways, the aviation sector leads the world in terms of crisis management, planning, training, and exercising. Some of the reasons I think are kind of quite obvious, but what would you suggest are some of the key learnings that organisations not from the aviation sector should take out of your approach to crisis management planning, and what would be the absolute prerequisites for an organisation, even if they're not in such a vulnerable sector? What should people be learning from the aviation sector?
Well, thank you for complimenting the aviation sector. I think there's a number of business sectors that are going to be very heavily focused on these kind of issues. So it's probably transportation, if we look at it a little bit more in general. Energy, if you're operating a nuclear power plant, you're going to have a lot of contingency plans in place as well. So I think there are a number of businesses out there that will do that. But even if you're just operating a mom and pop cleaners, every day you go to that crazy website Live Leak and you're seeing cars drive through windows and machines blow up and things of this nature. So you have to be ready for something unexpected to happen at your business. And so I think, the key for everybody is to make sure that you have just given a very quick think about what it is that could go wrong in your organization. And most organizations have some kind of risk register. And some of them are very fancy. In organizations such as ours, there's a whole department that's dedicated to corporate risk. In other places, it's somebody sitting behind a desk over coffee talking with someone about what could possibly go wrong and what they might need to do about it. And I think that kind of an exercise, people, sometimes are put off by it, but honestly, if you just put a whiteboard up and start writing things down within 15 minutes, you're not taking a lot of your own time. You can start putting together a pretty robust list of the kind of things that you need to at least think about. And then, of course, you go through and prioritize what's most likely to happen, or the opposite way that you can look at it is what's most likely to put you out of business. Sometimes those two things are complementary, but sometimes they're opposite. And then you can decide how you want to attack things.
Okay, no, that's great. Had you specifically planned or trained for a pandemic?
Yeah, so living in Asia, of course, we're always watching, health issues that are coming up. And of course, the Hong Kong, Asia area went through SARS, and that was a huge thing about 17 years ago. So we've always kind of had a focus on that. And then I would say that we're very fortunate at Cathay Pacific. We have a very good management team. We have a very good board. And the board last year actually said to us, we don't think you're being aggressive enough in your planning and your exercising around pandemics. We'd like to see something happen. So last year we had a huge exercise. It was named Cabin Fever. And what it basically did was combine our ability to test what would happen on the aircraft and what would happen in our campus facility by basically having two similar situations develop, one in flight, one at our facility, and then challenging our team to bring together as quickly as possible the realization that these people had interacted off-site at an event and then gone about their daily business, and all of a sudden the illness takes effect. And it's in two different locations, and we have to handle things, the same event, but in two different ways with two different teams attacking that. So, we went through that last year, and we, of course, learned a lot. But I'm glad we did it. I think we were able to seal off a few holes that would have probably bit us in the backside during this particular situation that we're undergoing now. But COVID-19 is just huge. And it's impacting every piece of everybody's business. And so, we didn't get that deep into it. So I'm glad what we did, but probably like every other business on earth, we were feeling a bit underprepared when this hit us.
And if an organization has both a crisis management plan and a pandemic plan, as it sounds like you did, how do those two things kind of fit together, or how should they fit together?
Yeah, well, and this is something we're going to revisit as well, because I think the way we have our plan set up is we have an emergency response plan, which looks after the things that are most likely going to happen to an airplane. And that's where we have to look after, obviously, the potential for an airline crash or something that would be that drastic. And then our business continuity plans, which are just our daily business continuity plans, these we kind of follow a four-prong approach, which is if we have loss of access, loss of systems, loss of supply, and shortage of staff, then you should be able, through those four, basic concepts, be able to deal with pretty much anything that comes your direction. But then just to supplement that, what we've done is we've said there are some things that are likely to happen to us, a public health emergency being one of them. And so therefore we take that business continuity plan and we focus in on that particular event and take pieces of the prong approach and apply those to that, along with some specialized knowledge. So in this particular instance, we would work very closely. We have a group medical department. We work very closely with them. We have an amazing doctor. Matter of fact, I don't know that this lady has slept in the past 3 months. She's doing an amazing job of helping lead the whole response to this. But she works with us to actually put the meat into the plan, so that we're making sure that we're really focused on the things that are going to be critical to us should something happen like this public health emergency.
And the point you're making there, I'd like to kind of expand on it or add to it as a general principle, really. Sometimes we get asked to develop a crisis management plan, which effectively is a series of checklists against the top 5 or top 10 risks that particular organization faces. And I would just counsel everybody on this webinar to have a crisis management plan or a way of working which applies whatever the crisis is. For me, one of the key benefits of a crisis management plan is having a structured, purposeful, well-organized, well-understood way of working in crisis that should apply whatever the crisis is, and then supplement that with those specific checklists or materials that relate to particular crisis types. There is value in both, but if you just have the top 10 risks and the checklists which are very specific to those, then you have no structures for ways of working if the crisis ends up not being the one that you had predicted would happen. So both is great. Just the checklists leave you exposed to an unexpected crisis. And I guess that in a way takes me back to the big crisis that you were faced with in 2001, Gus, 9/11, as managing director of corporate communications for American Airlines. Were there any lessons from that experience that you can translate to COVID-19, or were they just so different that the lessons didn't transfer, or any parallels maybe even in the two situations?
Yeah, I think there are some things that we can apply. Just before we move on, though, Jonathan, you brought up something really good, and I think I would just add to it as well.
Yeah.
And that one of the things that we do at Cathay is that we have a senior group of people that meets twice a year with us, at least twice a year, to kind of talk about crisis on a regular basis. And when I took over this job, the guy I took over from, great guy, did a wonderful job as well. He was kind of proud in telling me that he had gotten rid of that oversight, and it gave him a much freer atmosphere to be able to do the kind of things that he needed. And it didn't take me long getting into this job before I asked for that group to come back, because what I found was missing was ownership from the senior team. And so you talk about having the plans and doing all these other things. That's all great, but there's got to be a buy-in. There's got to be an ownership that has to be part of what you're doing, or otherwise on the day you're going to run into one of two situations. Yeah. One, people aren't going to know what to do, or two, they're just going to do something else because they don't know what they're supposed to do. Yeah. Where if you've got this ownership built in from the very beginning, people have a little bit of skin in the game, a pony in the race, whatever you want to call it. And it really works to your favor. So again, in these meetings, we sit down with our group and we walk them through the challenges that we're facing, and some of the issues that might be technical or monetary or whatever from that side, and work with them to try and come up with a solution where they feel that they own part of this. Yeah. And then what happens when, whether you have a crisis or an exercise or whatever, these people are there and they're being supporters and they're trying to explain things to people, and there's much more support behind that. So I would say if there's any way that you can put a group together and have that support behind you, it doesn't have to be the CEO. In our company, it's the number 3 guy, and he's brilliant and he does a great job championing, and I wouldn't want to be on his bad side. So it doesn't have to be the top guy, but just getting the senior guys together and getting them involved and trying to get that support, I think, is critical.
I would endorse that, and if I can add 2 further things to your further additions to my addition. Another misconception that we come across from time to time that I'd like people on this call to be aware of and be guarded against is almost the notion that the plan is the solution to the crisis. By having a plan, the plan itself will manage the crisis that you're facing. Again, that's a huge misconception. The crisis management plan does not provide all of the answers. It provides a framework, resources, materials, ways of working that enable the people in the team to manage the crisis. It is a facilitator of managing the crisis. It is not the solution itself. And the other thing I would endorse, which you touched on earlier as well, is that equally, a plan has very little value if it is not rehearsed and the people required to deploy it, have not had the opportunity to do so within a simulated environment. Because when people are under extreme pressure and there's enormous amounts at stake, whether it's money, reputations, or livelihoods, they are unlikely to be able to make sense of a plan that they have never deployed before. Even if it's a brilliant plan, they're simply not going to be able to deploy it. So that a plan is really important and really helpful, but it's only going to work if it has been rehearsed. And to your point again, it has the buy-in, backing, and support of the senior team.
So I don't think we're going to get away from this topic this quick. because I think, again, if we've got people on the line who have not really had a chance to go through this in detail, I think it's critical that they understand this. So, in our crisis leadership program that we talked about, we did last year for everybody, I shocked people because we spend a lot of time making sure that every single one of our what we call ports, which is a facility in a foreign country that we fly to, that they have a plan and that it's updated regularly and that people are schooled on and so on. But I said to them, to be honest with you, you'll never probably open that plan on the day of a crisis. Yeah. Maybe as reference, you might flip through it to try and find a phone number or something like that. But the reality is the plan is what is useful in front of the crisis, because it is what you use to make sure that you've thought through what you need to do. Yeah. And then you cross-checked, again, these functional exercises that we do, that for every what that you decided that you need to do, you have documented in this plan how you're going to do it. Yeah. And that, again, as you say, then when you drill it with folks, then they understand what it is they have to do. They will, be able to do it because they've resource that they know the what, they understand the how, and then the checklist that you talk about, those are going to be useful on the day. That they can take with them. But our plan gets broken down into these little port go kits that people just pick up a packet and run with. They don't need the whole plan. They just need to understand their part at that point. Yeah. So the plan itself just becomes a reference document at that moment. And we challenge every single one of our people to have the first 5 things on their checklist in their head memorized. so that they don't even have to think about it. And then when I get to my checklist, I'll know that I just am basically checking that I've done the first 5 things or 6 things or 8 things or whatever it is that they need to go through. And I think it's important to do that. And then again, obviously, to make sure we forget that these little things are computers, and that you've got PDF copies of whatever it is you need in there to make sure that you can just flip that thing on. It's just simple stuff.
Yeah.
But I think you say people think, oh, I've got the plan.
Yeah.
And it's just a great thing in the world. And I will tell you so this will make our segue back to the question that you originally asked me, and that is 9/11. We never opened the plan. We didn't have time. But we knew what we needed to do because we had exercised, we had gone through that, we had discussed what needed to be done, and we understood that. Unfortunately, we had a little bit of practice in advance as well, so that made us a little bit quicker on our heels. But
yeah.
The issue is that you cannot depend on that plan at the time. The plan is valuable to you in front of the crisis because, again, it gets you thinking about that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Really great insights.
Now we'll switch over to the question that you had asked me, which is
learning or parallels
that we had
9/11.
9/11.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, first of all, you were right. These are very different events. So I think 9/11 was horrifically tragic. Many people lost their lives in a very, very terrible event. I think the difference with what we're seeing with COVID-19 is, and I apologize if anybody thinks that I'm off track here, but in 9/11, you sort of understood what you were fighting, and the response milestones, the things that you were trying to achieve, seemed to have a logical sequence to them, and they seem to be closer together than what we're seeing from COVID-19, and it seemed like the enemy was well defined, if you could. With COVID-19, it's just question marks everywhere. And it leaves people, myself and yourself, frustrated as well because you just can't put your finger on it. But I would tell you that leads me to the very first learning that I would share with you from 9/11 that I think is applicable to COVID-19. And this comes from a very smart guy that I used to work with named Al Como at American Airlines. And Al was always very cautionary with us, sitting there saying, remember what we've learned through crises, which is a week from today, 50% of what we think we know will not be valid anymore. It will have changed dramatically. So part of what you have to do in your rush to try and respond in some way is to have a bit of patience in understanding that things are still developing and that we still have quite a bit of things that we don't know yet. So, as you start driving forward with some kind of strategy, you've still got to leave yourself some wiggle room, and you've still got to be able to understand that things are still developing. And 1 week from now, you may find that the course that you took off on is just not applicable at all. So I would say that that's probably lesson number one.
And
lesson
Gus,
number
how do you balance that? Because one end of the spectrum, you wait until you know everything, in which case you are responding 12 months after the crisis happened. At the other extreme, you are, reacting, communicating, making decisions really, really early that may turn out not to be the best ones with the benefit of hindsight. What's your guidance or experience of how to get the right balance between the two?
Well, I think the biggest thing is to get things into categories, right? There are certain things that you have to get done right away. So when we look at things like in an aircraft accident, right? We look at things like we have got to get people rescued. We've got to identify who relatives are. We've got to get people reunited with those folks. We've got to make sure that people in hospital have communications to talk to loved ones and so on. Those are things that you just have to get done. And if you don't have all the pieces to it, or you don't know all the information for it, it's not that big of a thing. You can just keep moving. But things that are going to have a little bit more time to get things done, those are the kind of things then that you try to again start putting steps in place that you can take in a response, so that you're not doing nothing, but that you're measured in your approach and that you're thinking through things. Another good thing that I would tell you, and I saw this, I thought it was a brilliant strategy from the folks at Fly Dubai after an accident. in which they shared with us that they weren't real familiar with the location that they were responding to. And so they brought together a group of people to help kind of vet things for them. So local people who understood the language and the culture and how things would be, perceived and so on, and work with them. And in normal times, I would sit there and go, we don't have time for that. But in reality, when you sit and think about it, it's a brilliant strategy. And what they were doing was they had still tight timelines, but they built into those timelines the ability to get some extra counsel to make sure that they were getting enough information that as they started down this path, they were taking smart steps rather than just leaping to get something done. And I think it's not a science; it's a lot of gut, and you just sometimes have to feel your way through. But again, I think that the learning point is that we just have to be realistic about the fact that because we don't know so much, a week from now, things are going to be very, very different. We will be judged on what we did, even though part of what we were trying to do was move fast.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think this, again, is one of the benefits of rehearsal, because I think often leaders of businesses and organizations like to be in control and, like most people, prefer certainty. In a crisis, sadly, you don't have control and you don't have certainty, and there is an extent to which you need to become comfortable with uncertainty and a certain level of lack of control. And as I say, I think particularly for senior business people who are used to being able to, or think that they can control everything, that's one of the disorientating things about a crisis.
It is, and again, we'll go back to a little bit about exercising and again why it's so important. So as part of our exercise regime, we also do a senior management exercise. And so last year, what we did, just as an example, excuse me, we brought in the former CEO of Malaysia Airlines, and we brought in the crisis director for MH370 and MH17, and we let senior management talk to them in a way that these were senior managers talking to senior managers. So help me understand what my role is. It's not Gus telling me what my role should be, but it's you who've done this. Understand what it is. And it was a brilliant opportunity for us to do that. We spend a lot of time with our senior management team, and especially with the senior team that works inside our crisis response center, because so when you get up at that level, not that I've ever been there, but for my observations, life kind of comes to you in a certain way. Your appointments are set in a certain way. The proposals that you're going to review arrive in a certain fashion and so on. And I think what happens is you forget a little bit of your days when you were a little farther down the ladder about having to struggle and handle things as they came at you. And that's exactly what's going to happen to you in a crisis. And so part of working with the senior team is helping them go back to the days when they had to make decisions without as much information as they wanted, and to be innovative about how they get information and think about what resources they can look at, rather than maybe having as much stuff come to them in an organized fashion that they're used to. So again, you got to spend time with everybody, and that includes the senior team. Even if they scare you, you've got to get in there and work with them, because as you say, otherwise the day comes. And the worst thing that can happen to you, the absolute worst thing, is you've spent all this time practicing with people, teaching them about your plan, doing all of this kind of stuff, and senior management comes in and says, we're not going to do it that way. And then everybody standing in front of you now has no idea what they're going to do, because they were trained to do something one way, and now they're going to do it a different way, and they don't know what that is. They don't know who to take orders from and things like that. It just turns into a mega mess. So you have really, really, really got to get engaged. That's why I go back to that whole idea of getting people to, to have a pony in the race at the very beginning, so that they're already buying into this. And when the time comes, it isn't a question of we're going to do something different as much as it's going to be, okay, we know what we're going to do, support these guys to make sure that they can get it done.
Right. I'm going to stay quiet as you go through learning too.
So I guess the other thing that I was going to mention is just being ready for that second crisis. I think is the thing that was a huge learning from 9/11. And I'm not just talking about the second crisis on the day, because if you think about 9/11, excuse me, we had 2 airplanes in 2 different places, 2 different sets of circumstances, all driven around the same event. So
Yeah.
Even on that day, we were not functioning the way we would want it to, because again, our whole plans were always on one thing. But what I'm talking about is 6 weeks later, on the 12th of November, we lost another aircraft. So we're in the midst of handling what might be the one of the worst crises that the United States has ever seen, certainly the worst crisis that the company's ever seen. And then all of a sudden we have another airplane down. And then it's like, what do you do at this point? Because everybody is engaged already, and yet you've still got to break people off, function people around, move around, and figure out how you're going to deal with this crisis. And one of the biggest issues that comes up at that point is fatigue, crisis fatigue, which is your team is just like, I'm going to help as best I can, but I am, I'm given everything I've got up to this point. What am I going to give again? And then I was attending a webinar, so I don't only talk on them, I actually listen to them as well. I was asked on a webinar that I was listening in on to what they felt the biggest issue was going to be if we had a second wave of COVID. And not surprisingly, the answer was fatigue. Medical people being fatigued about having to deal with the next wave, people being fatigued about being put back in their houses again, businesses being fatigued about being a good start and then they have to stop again, and so on. So it's a huge issue, but that's a key component of it. But just if you think in aggregate, the whole idea of having to handle a second crisis, and if you don't think that's going to happen, all you have to do at the moment right now is talk to all the people in the Philippines who are sitting there. And right now, Wangfeng is a typhoon that is hitting the Philippines at full force. That country is still under lockdown and so on. And their emergency response people, their medical people, their frontline responders and so on are having to now deal with 2 things at once, both of which are life-threatening and some of which have contradictory rules about what they're supposed to do. So, I mean, you got to give that some thought too, because I guarantee you, as we go through this COVID thing, some of the people on this phone call right today are going to have things happen to them. They're going to have to balance a second crisis in their hands.
And I'm going to break my promise immediately by adding to what you've just said. I mean, for me, that is a really big concern and something that I really would like to see businesses focusing on, because there are already businesses struggling as a result of COVID-19. And, for those who work so hard to stay in business, I don't want to see them suffer further harm because of a crisis that happens in 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 months' time. And I think that's particularly challenging because COVID-19 itself has weakened businesses. It's weakened them in terms of the value. It's weakened them in terms of revenue coming into those businesses. It's weakened them in terms of people being available to work. There's all sorts of reasons why actually dealing with a second crisis would be even more difficult than in normal times. However, if we think about, for example, cybercrime, for those people who were on last week's webinar, sadly, cybercrime is absolutely on the rise at the moment because the bad guys are taking advantage of the fact that people are working from home, their guard is down, some of the security that would be in place in their business network isn't there. They're hungry for advice, and so phishing emails are coming out disguised as emails from the World Health Organization. My message is that Gus is absolutely right. You will be feeling fatigued, but please do everything in your power to protect yourself now, because it may be, exactly to Gus's point, the next crisis, the second crisis, that is the one that really harms your business, having made your way through this initial challenge. So do be vigilant out there and do be ready for what may happen next.
Yeah, I think you posted an article on LinkedIn, Jonathan, from the Financial Times. I'm sorry, I can't remember the gentleman's name that wrote it. But yeah, it was a brilliant piece to kind of walk through and talk through just about why people aren't prepared and why they try to do things. The thing that I think he missed in there, and again, he did a brilliant job, was that I think part of the reason that we don't always follow through on the crisis that we're dealing with is because the next crisis comes. And so what happens is we have all these grand plans to try and fix the stuff that we learned here, or to try and you know, make things happen. But the next crisis comes and hits us, and we're off on that path. And it just, you know, a lot of businesses just go from crisis to crisis to crisis. And I'm sure people could sit there and say, well, if you did all the planning that you're supposed to do, you'd have something in place. It wouldn't be a crisis every time. But, you know, the world is not as manageable as it used to be. You said something earlier that reminded me that, again, I've been in the business for a long time. I'm an old guy. And I remember days when crisis management, people would sit there and say, you know, what we need to do is control this crisis. And we ultimately learned to laugh at that. And then the next stage was, we need to manage this crisis. And we now laugh at that, because really what you're trying to do is influence the crisis. And if you're able to do that, that is success at every means. But it's just, again, the second crisis is a difficult thing. As you say, you've got to be ready to handle it. It will divert resources. My point, in a roundabout way, is to get to the point of the fact that the other learning from 9/11 is that you've got to stick to your guns and get things done. And I think that's going to be even more important in COVID-19, because I think in listening to what the medical professionals say, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, but in listening to what these people are saying, I think a second wave is coming. And I think we just have to be ready for that. And if we haven't taken what we've learned now, modified our plans, tried to do training as quickly as we can, tried to make the changes that we're going to need to do, you know, I don't know how further down our pants are going to be, but that's what's going to happen. And we're going to have no one to blame but ourselves, because we got diverted. And I know, you know, I'm sure there are people who are on this call right now who are like, I'm the only person that concentrates on emergency response. I'm full out at the moment from that side. I get that, understand. In our organization, I have a bigger team, but same issue. But we still got to do that, and we owe that to our colleagues, and we owe that to the people who are our customers and our business partners and so on, to try and make that possible. And that's not just you. That means your business unit. So I'm on the call today representing Cathay Pacific, but I will tell you, when it comes to the COVID-19 response, my team was a support team. They were not the leaders in this. Our business units were the ones that took the lead. And, you know, our operations teams, the guys who fly the planes, who work behind the scenes with the aircraft, the cabin crew, service delivery teams at the airports were amazing. Our planning and scheduling guys, and especially, as I said before, our group medical department. These were the guys who were leading the fight. But I've got to encourage them now to take everything that they've learned and get that maneuvered, because when we come back at it again, I don't want everybody looking at each other going, well, didn't we fix this last time? And we're only going to have a very short time. We're only going to have a couple of months before this comes up and bites us again, if that's what happens. And for those of us that operate in both hemispheres, we may not even have that much time. Maybe more time at our head office, but still some of our facilities in the outskirts, we may have to be dealing with it right away. So we've just got to find time to get that built in. So I was talking with my head of group visit, my head of business continuity today, telling him that we've got 2 weeks where we've got to get all the stuff into the learnings into a bucket, get that stuff built in, make sure we go out and validate that, and then be ready in case the next wave bites us faster than what we're anticipating.
And obviously, without breaking any confidentialities, you know, were there particular challenges that you saw organizations facing? Are there thematically learnings that you see coming out of COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, all businesses we had lots of learnings ourselves. I won't spend time on us because a lot of them are specific to the airline industry, but I think there were a couple key things that people just need to be aware of, that, and it's things we all know but we forget or we don't spend a lot of time on. And the biggest eye opener for me, and again, I've been in the business for a bit, was I just really didn't fully understand how interdependent we are on other companies and other organizations. The supply chains, the people that provide us services and things like that. And, you know, every one of our contracts that we have says that our suppliers must have a business continuity plan and they must be able to, conduct business and so on. But if you think about how difficult it was for our own organization, it's just as difficult for your suppliers and your third parties as well, but they're critical. And then the other thing that was kind of a learning for me was the whole fear factor, and the fact that people are, I remember 9/11, people were afraid on the day, at least at our organization. I had people ask me if they could go home. They thought it was the end of the world. They wanted to spend it with their families, and I had to convince them to stay and try and help our organization. But the fear on this one is different. This one, I think it's greater. It impacts more people. We're seeing huge amounts of death that don't seem to stop. And so that fear factor is coming in. And so just as a learning from us to kind of illustrate this, when we were still trying to go out and fly, and we've reduced a lot of flying at the moment, when we're still going out and trying to fly, we may have been able to secure the overflight clearance. We might have been able to secure the gates and things like that, and the staff and so on. But we may not have been able to secure a hotel for our crew because people didn't want people coming from a hot spot to then land in their hotel. And so we could do everything that we could possibly control, only to find out at the other end we couldn't accommodate our staff. So we then had problems in trying to find that accommodation. So I think this whole idea of fear and the fact that third parties are so interconnected now just has really left me well aware of the need to make sure that we are really working with our critical partners and understanding who they are and really trying to understand whether they're able to weather something like this as well.
And actually, again, we can't hope to do this perfectly, but thinking beforehand about what might we need in a crisis, what might happen in a crisis, what could be the impact of that on us, and just starting to work out some of those vulnerabilities and putting contingencies or alternative plans in place is another, I think, really important part of your scenario planning and your crisis management planning. You won't get all of it, but the more of those holes you can plug ahead of time, the better chance you have of succeeding.
Yeah, and I think you also learn a lot. What we learned a lot was that, a lot of the internal departments that sometimes get overlooked are critical. So I always try to make I learned very early in my career, that was beat into me, that the most important person inside any facility is the custodian. And so I always try to say hello to them when I come in and make friends with them. And we have a tradition in Hong Kong where we give Life packets on Chinese New Year. I always try to make sure that I give those to our custodial staff. But boy, oh boy, have you learned how important those people are right now.
Yes.
And how keeping them motivated and safe and so on is just critical to you. But it's the same. It's just understanding how all that interconnectivity inside your company works as well. And again, we have our IT department, which everybody obviously depends on. And the reality was they became critical because all of a sudden we had staff working at home. If the IT systems didn't work, then it just obviously the whole thing fell apart. And so again, just the whole interconnectivity thing, internally, externally, huge for you to sit and focus on and just make sure that those things are in place. And there's also, again, just the new reality that what you need to look at moving forward. So as people start coming back to work, and again, we have a huge campus, but maybe you just have, a small office with 5 people, whatever. It's still a question of how people are going to feel about being together at this particular moment. What's the rules going to be about, protective gear and spacing and all this other kind of things. And it's critical that all that be thought out. At our company, before we brought everybody back to work this week, tremendous job by our property services team, by our people team and our group medical. In front of our lifts were, taped off the whole social distancing thing for quite a ways to help people get in queue. We, made policy decisions about only 6 people per lift and so on. So all of those things were in place so people understood coming in how things were going to change a bit from that side. And again, you talked about my passion as a humanitarian side. I want people to feel comfortable as they can feel in these unfamiliar and uncomfortable situations. So it's huge to do that. And again, I salute. We're just a support team. I salute the folks and people and properties and in medical that got all this stuff together and made it happen so that people could feel comfortable when they came back to work.
Okay, so I've just got 1 or 2 questions left. I'd encourage anyone in the audience to post their questions via the question pane. We've got a couple already, but we will take 2 or 3 questions in the final 10 minutes of this session. I wanted to come back to the kind of importance of learning the lessons and acting on them. Have you got any kind of tips or advice, Gus, as to how organisations can do that best? For example, if they're running a meeting to try and draw the learnings out, what is the best way of getting best value out of those sessions?
So we kind of use a suite of tools to try and help with things. So usually we will send around a questionnaire that allows people on their own time to try and provide information for them. We try to do that as soon after an event as possible. Of course, This is an ongoing situation, so you can do that at various stages along the way. But that allows people to kind of give you information on a regular basis and quite quickly while it's still top of mind for them. We also do debriefing sessions more formally with people who will bring people in and sit down and talk to them. Or again, what I find to be a much better tool is sometimes to use these functional exercises where we take something that didn't work very well and then we create an exercise which is nothing more than 10 or 12 PowerPoint slides with situations on them, and then we sit in a room and we talk through how we would handle this, and we make sure that we have all the parties that would be involved, and we just kind of work it through, and we come up to a solution, and everybody sits at the end of it and goes, "That's great." Normally they'd shake hands, now we elbow bump, but the whole idea is that you still, you reach a conclusion and you move forward with it. But yeah, we also do formal reports. We're required to do that for documentation purposes, things like that. I don't know that those big things help you in the long run. What is important is if those reports contain action items, that you make sure that those are done. We are held to very tight timelines, both to that senior management group and also to an oversight group that audits us, to make sure that we have things done as quickly as possible once we identify them as an issue. And that's critical for you to do as well.
And how about how do you create the right atmosphere in which some of those review meetings can take place? How do you avoid people feeling that they can't, flag that something went wrong, or maybe even that they did something wrong? How do you create the right atmosphere for those reviews?
Well, I think we have a little bit of a leg up maybe with some other industries, because in aviation we practice what's called a just culture. Which is basically all about the fact that we want to learn what didn't go well or what did go well, because you can learn from both of those things, with no blame associated with it in most instances. And the whole idea, obviously, then is to make people feel comfortable about doing that.
Yeah.
And I look for every possible way. So our group risk department, which is a department that looks at corporate risk across the board, we focus more on operational risk. They held a session to try and figure out why sometimes we weren't hitting the nail on the head in operational risk management. And they invited me to the session, and I declined. And they said, "Why are you not coming? This is a huge thing about your department." And I said, "Because if I'm the problem, people have to feel comfortable saying that. And they're not going to feel comfortable saying that if I'm in the room. So the best thing that I can do for you is not be there. And then you can share with me what came back. I don't have to be there to hear it personally. And if I'm there, naturally as an individual, I'm going to feel defensive a bit as well. I don't want to do that. I really want to learn from what you're going to come back with me." So, I mean, you just have to look through some of those things. Sometimes, just you may be the issue that you need to take out of the equation or whatever. But I think if organizations can help people understand that, look, we're just trying to understand what didn't go well or what did go well. If it didn't go well, we want to fix it. If it did go well, we want to repeat it. So, understanding both of those things as quickly and as completely as possible.
Fantastic. And that also covers off, I believe, a question that Andrew Taylor asked. So hopefully, Andrew, that does answer your question. So I'm going to move on to questions from participants now. So from Brandon, who says, "Thanks for your time and great presentation. What advice do you have to help motivate the front line?" So in your instance, cabin crew, service desks, etc., when the new normal is introduced, tackling the fear factor and at times the feeling that their safety may be being sacrificed for the bottom line. And I know Brandon comes from an industry where it's a different industry, but they will be facing similar challenges.
Sure, and again, none of us know what the new normal is going to be, and I won't, try to speculate on that. I think it just comes down to a really core fundamental of communication, and it always amazes me, as much as we are communicators, that this is the thing we do worst. But it's just information. It's just sharing honest information, being as transparent as you can, as early as you can. There are going to be things that you're going to be asked to do that maybe you can't do, and you just need to explain why that is. And there are going to be things that you're going to need them to do that don't make sense to them. You're going to need to explain that. If you have time and your capabilities and it's your culture, you may be able to have work groups or things like that, work through new ways to come up with ideas that achieve the same thing, but are done differently and in a way that's seen as more user-friendly. But the bottom line is just explaining it. People just want to know, and then they can make choices and decisions and things of that nature. Sometimes that decision is to gripe, but that's just part of human nature. But it's just knowing. Once you know, then I think you can move forward with that. So without getting into specifics, again, nobody knows what the new normal is going to be. I think as long as you're trying to be honest and transparent, again, if you have time, maybe you can put a work group together to try and achieve something. That would be my advice.
Fantastic. Two questions which I think may be related. Firstly, from Philip, who's joining us from Santiago. How quickly can you detect the scale of this type of a crisis? Unlike an air crash, it's invisible and silent. Do you have a notification or reporting system that helps rapidly get the total picture? Interrelated question from Matt, who says, do you recommend the use of software tooling to support your crisis management and communication process? So how do you track or get early sight of a crisis of this kind and get the whole picture? Do you use software to support your crisis management and communication process?
Sure. So I think this is one of the learnings that we're taking back from this. So we typically decide early who are going to be our key organizations that we take our information from, and who we follow, and therefore we base our decisions based on that. Some of that guidance is provided to us from a regulatory standpoint, and then some of it is just made decisions by the corporation. In this particular instance, our main organization is WHO. And we just have a standing decision that when it's global in nature, we'll follow the WHO, and that we will take the information that they provide. We'll then supplement that with the local jurisdictions and the information that comes to us from those organizations, so that we can then make local decisions as we need to make them, incorporating in our local management as well, so they can again have, because they have better insight about rules and regulations, customs, and things like that they need to work through. So I think that you just have to make a determination of who you're going to use from that perspective. Obviously, we also try to hear from our local people as well. What are you seeing? What are you hearing from, and so on. The learning, I think, that we've taken back is that we have a standing committee, but we met on an ad hoc basis. And so one of the things that we've talked about is that we have a regular meeting, and we bring up what's happening in the world. And if it's nothing, the meeting's over in 15 minutes. And if it's something, then we sit and talk about it a little bit more, and decide whether or not it needs to be followed a little bit closer. So again, we have a group medical department, but they're small. They have a lot of stuff on their plate. They do a fantastic job, but they could certainly use some help from other folks, sharing information and saying, do we need to think about this, or so on, and then they provide the professional guidance to us. So I think that's one of the changes that we'll probably be making down the road. And then the question regarding software, I think, there's lots of stuff that you can think about. And I think software is great, and I think there are some great programs out there, and there's some great things that companies are doing. We know of one company in our industry that uses information they know about people's travel patterns to after they've opted into the system, to be able to send them warning messages that something is happening in the general vicinity, whether that's a natural disaster or an active shooter or something of that nature to them. And that definitely, I think, is extremely helpful. I think the hard part with those now is they have to be opt-in because of privacy concerns and things of that nature. So And then we've had a long discussion in our company, again, getting a little off track, but still sticking to this general concept, like the active shooter, or what we call a violent event response plan. If you send a message to somebody and they're hiding from somebody, and they haven't remembered to turn their thing off, you just given away their position.
Yeah.
From that. And so, there's so many things you have to think through and try to do that. So I think there's great technology out there. I think you just have to really spend some time with what is it you want to accomplish, and is the technology going to be the right way? I told you before, I'm a really old guy. I always am a little skeptical of technology, because even with crisis, as I try to train all my crisis managers with, I always still have a pack of Post-it notes that we use on the board, because to this date in my career, paper has never broken.
Very good. We're into the last kind of 3 or 4 minutes. I've got a couple of things I want to cover off before the end of the session, but a great question from Alice. Much broader question. Gus, how do you stay optimistic?
So I'm a little afraid to answer this, because the answer is I'm a little bit of a sick individual, and I just love crisis. When I'm not optimistic is when something's not happening, because then I'm bored. But I think I do be a little bit more serious about it. Look, there's a small group of people in this world who run towards problems rather than running away from them. And if you're tasked with that, I hope you can take it seriously. Again, I love it, so I live for it, but there's a responsibility that comes with it, and I don't think anybody ought to be in this job if they don't take that portion seriously. So anytime something like this comes, I feel like I have an obligation, not only to me because I have a job and I want to be paid tomorrow, but I have an obligation based on senior management trusting me to be someone who helps them put together programs and plans and exercises and things like that gets people ready for this kind of stuff, so that businesses can survive, and most importantly, that people can survive, and that they know there's someone out there always thinking about that. One of the interesting things when I fly on the system, and that'll be great to be able to do again someday, is I'll be with the crews and they'll ask me what it is I do, and I'll explain it, and they'll sit there and go, I didn't know we had somebody who did that, because we don't spend a lot of time self-promotion. But they're like, I'm so glad it's great that somebody's thinking about me and my family if something happens. And I just think you have to find that intrinsic value and understand the importance of your job, and what it really means in the long term to the survival of the organization, but again, more importantly, to the survival of the people who are your colleagues.
Gus, thank you. That was incredibly valuable. I could certainly sit here talking with you for the next couple of hours, because your experience and your insights are so rich, and you're so generous in sharing them, that, as I say, we could go on for another couple of hours at least. I'd be happy to do that. That would take you towards midnight, so I think that would be a little bit unfair, and I did promise everybody on this call that we would finish on time. But thank you so much. That was incredibly insightful.
Thank you. And to all the people out there, thanks very much for joining us. I hope all you and your families are safe. Please stay safe. And again, if I can just say one thing, it's just please do honor our first responders, the people who are out there in the ambulances, on the front lines, in the hospitals and things like that, by staying home and following whatever advice the government is giving you. I know it's hard, but you're honoring them by doing that. Thanks.
2 pieces of housekeeping before we formally finish the webinar. The first really is just to pick up on what Gus was saying about the importance of learning lessons. This is research that we've done with 70 of you guys, really, 70 of our clients, contacts, and those working in the area of crisis management. I just wanted to draw your attention to 2 of these statistics. The one at the top, 62% of the people we talked with said that their business was now more vulnerable to the impact of a crisis than before COVID-19, and only 42% towards the bottom of that graphic, or rather 42% said another crisis would have a serious or extremely serious impact on their business. So please do take the time now to learn the lessons from your initial response to COVID-19 and again, to Gus's point, act on them. Don't just review them, update or upgrade your crisis management plans as a result. You may have a very short window of opportunity. Now, next week, we are maintaining the transportation theme for our webinar, but from a very different perspective. So joining us at 1 o'clock UK next Thursday, the 21st, will be Steve Stewart. Steve is the Director of Communications for Stagecoach, one of the UK's leading bus and train companies, and he will be sharing his insights and learnings from COVID-19, and another guy who'll be sharing his 30 years experience from being in the front line of crisis communication in particular. And I think that will be very interesting as public transport in the UK begins to return and people are being encouraged to get back to work. I think, again, Steve's insights into the actions and the communication that they're putting in place to facilitate that will be incredibly useful. So thank you all for joining this session. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to do so. I wish you well. And once more, please do take the time now to learn from what has happened so far and to act on that to make sure that your business is prepared for another crisis, which sadly may be just around the corner. Thank you. Thanks again, Gus. And I hope we'll see you all again next week.